Is there anything more American than apple pie? Yeah, there is. Than 1911. Apple pie. It's not even from here, and apples are from Kazakhstan. But the 1911, right here. American. The cartridge, the 45 ACP is American. The platform is American. Its use by us. Fight what I'm going to call is literal evil in the world. Fascism. The Nazis. Genocide. What about today? That was all good and well back when we had horse cavalry in 1911. Well, what about today? Well, I'd argue that it's still a fine fighting implement. Did an entire episode on are 1911s still relevant? And I think that they are. If you want to refute the entire basis of that, you can go listen to that episode. You're totally welcome to disagree with me. But I think they are still relevant, even in a world of plastic fantastics. So, what are some of the best ones today? What are the best 1911s for gunfighting? Maybe not for collecting or for a barbecue, but for actual gunfighting. That's what we're going to talk about today. Hello, gunfighters, and welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting and gun-related stuff the right way with God at the center. So I think I'm going to forego the lengthy bio. Try to abbreviate it. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Professional big game hunter and guide. If you feel called to support, check out Patreon. There should be a link in the show notes. With that, I am your host, Michael Milito, and I am blessed to serve you today. The 1911. Now, a purist would disagree with all of this, I think, and they would say only the original 1911 is a 1911. Not even the 1911A1. Here's how I'm going to define a 1911 for this podcast. A single stack 45 ACP that you could take an original government 1911 slide or frame and it will be compatible with these. Now, 1911s aren't like Glocks. You can't just throw them all in a bin and shake them up and put them together. There's a fitting and fit and finish and actual hand fitting a lot of times, but you get what I'm saying. They would be compatible. Also, for this discussion, I mentioned 45. I don't see anything heretical about a 1911 and 9mm. But for today, we're talking about 45s. But if I mention a certain model, just know that there's probably a 9mm counterpart in a lot of them. Maybe not all of them, but in many of them. So if you want the 9mm, or if you want a 10mm, some of those have a 10mm version, either the same model or they call it a different model. For the discussion today, to keep it along the lines of a 1911, we're talking single stack 45 compatible with the original pattern of the slide and frame. If you like the double stacks, I would say I do too. I just did an entire episode. I don't know if it'll come out before or after this on the STI Staccato, but that's not today's discussion. Also, these were what I'm going to quantify as production grade guns. I do really like Wilson Combat and Nighthawk Custom and guns like that. I'm going to leave those custom or semi-custom guns in that really high price point off of this list. Not that there's anything wrong with them. They're absolutely amazing, and I would have no problem using a Wilson Combat 1911 in lieu of any of these models. But for today, I'm kind of trying to stick with mostly production, kind of off-the-shelf models of a 1911. And for me, you could argue where that line stops, but for me, I'm going to stop it at like those high-end custom or semi-custom 1911s. Alright, enough of the preamble and the caveats. Let's get into the day's discussion. Where do we start? I am going to start with Colt. I mean, where else would you start in a discussion of good fighting 1911s? Colt, the company, has had issues over the years as far as financial stuff goes, but I don't think their 1911s have suffered because of it. The Colts made today are awesome. The Colts made 20 years ago are awesome, and the Colts made 100 years ago are awesome. The Colt 1911 is kind of that epitome of a combat fighting 1911, and they make some really good models into the 21st century. They still make the Colt Combat Elite. It is the one, if you want to quantify it the way I did for the episode, 1911 that I own, single stack 45. It is the one. I sold my other one to fund the Alaska Rifle Project, so I am down to one like traditional 1911, but it's a good one. Colt Combat Elite. It is a phenomenal, phenomenal gun, and I would have no problem carrying that gun. A Colt Combat Elite. It is a full-size government frame and slide 1911, which I think is the best version of it. It is improved for modern gunfighting. It's called the Combat Elite, and I think it has combat in mind. It has a Colt National Match barrel. It has Novak style sights, really good usable combat sights, as opposed to like the original 1911, which they're okay, but there's better sights out there. And these are really good sights. It is a traditional bushing barrel. There's nothing wrong with that. I actually prefer that because I like to shoot a lot, and a lot cheaper and easier to fit and replace a bushing than a slide and barrel. It has the extender beaver tail, which I think pretty much all modern 1911s will, unless it's like a throwback to the original. It's got a flat main spring, and it's a two-tone, and that makes it very attractive to the eye. Not really important for the gunfighting, but on that two-tone slide, the slide and frame two-tone, it is scalloped and cut out to aid in ejection, which is one of the things you can do or can have custom done to make a 1911 even a little bit more reliable. But this comes with that, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good balance of having a lot of really good features without having a bunch of stuff you don't really need. The Colt Combat Elite, I'll just briefly mention, you probably know the 10mm version, if it's a very similar version in 10mm, the Colt Delta Elite. Very good gun. And if you want even more modern with a rail, which is a good thing too, the Combat Unit Rail. Still listed on their website. It's basically what I discussed, although it has a rail on it. The next one, SIG. I mentioned another podcast kind of jokingly, but the only thing they really don't make, it seems, is a revolver. Maybe they'll come out with a SIG revolver. But they do and have made for quite a while 1911s. If I was picking one, and they make a lot of really nice 1911s, really fancy 1911s, but if I was picking one for a gunfighting 1911 from SIG, I would pick the Emperor Scorpion. Now, these have been around, and I think they've changed. They either call it the Emperor Scorpion or the just Scorpion. Either way, full-size 1911 with a rail on the frame. Single stack 45. Some of the models, it seems, come with a straight flat trigger, which I really like. One of the things I don't have on the Colt Combat Elite, but I do like a flat trigger. It's one of the great things about a 1911 is that straight back trigger, and I like a straight back trigger. Extended beaver tail, really good grips. Some of them have kind of the fancy, I think they're probably G10 grips. And what kind of sets this one apart, the Scorpion version, is it's got really good metal coatings. It should be quite a bit more impervious to the elements than a traditional blued 1911. Why not take advantage of that? Comes in kind of that flat dark earth, whatever color they call it. It's that kind of color, that kind of desert scheme. It's a really good 1911, a good fighting 1911, and although I've never owned a SIG 1911, I've known people that have, and I haven't had really any bad feedback from them. So I'm going to put it on the list. The next one, and this is probably going to be your most budget-friendly option, and it should be no surprise who that comes from. Ruger. American-made. This is not a list of the cheapest 1911s that might work. This is a list of the best, in my opinion, fighting 1911s of 2023. And this one is not crazy expensive. The just regular SR 1911, they make a lot of different versions, but for the fighting one, I think just the SR 1911, full size, government size, is a fantastic 1911. In fact, it's set up very similarly to the Colt Combat Elite that I have. Except for it being two-toned, this one is all stainless, which I think is fantastic. I really like stainless, and that's one of the things that Ruger does well. They make really good guns in stainless. It also even has the scalloped ejection port to aid in the reduction of feeding issues. Double diamond wood grips, nothing wrong with that, and that's one of the great things about the 1911. You can put on there pretty much any number of grips, G10, whatever. That extended beaver tail, again, set up very similar to a Colt Combat Elite. Good Novak 1911 sights. And since they're Novak and they're machined into the dovetails, they're cut into the dovetails, you can replace those too if you want, although they're probably fine sights. I like to take a Sharpie and black out my rear sight, so my rear sight is just black on pretty much all my guns. But good sights. And by far, I don't like to talk prices, but by far cheaper than any of the other guns talked about so far. One thing I will point out on the Ruger is I believe the frame is investment casting. You may or may not care about that. One of the benefits of that, though, is that you can have the plunger tube integral into the frame. And I don't have one in front of me, but I believe they do that, which is a spare part, a separate part, I should say, on, not a spare part, but a separate part on your normal 1911, which can work loose. I've never had it happen. I've never even seen it happen, but it can happen. And it shouldn't happen on the Ruger. That being said, most people view investment casting as less desirable than forging. That is one of the things with the Ruger, but I think they'd be a good 1911, and I put them on this list not because of price, but because I think they're a good fighting 1911. And the price is just an added bonus. So if you're looking to get into the world of a 1911, not sure if you're going to like it or not, but want a good one, really the Ruger is a good place to look. The next one, I think, is kind of a sleeper. And it's the only not American-made one on the list. And I'm okay with that because it's made in Israel. If you didn't know, IWI, Magnum Research, same ones that make the Desert Eagle, they also make a 1911. In fact, some of the 1911s are stamped Desert Eagle 1911. The Magnum Research 1911s. I think they're kind of a sleeper because a lot of people that are into guns know IWI. They know the Desert Eagle, they know the Tavor, but they may not even be aware that they make 1911s. And I think they make pretty good 1911s from my experience. The Magnum Research 1911s, I'm talking about their standard full size. They come in a couple of different finishes, stainless, whatever their black coating is, whether it's Cerakote or Parkerized or something like it. It looks like a good usable finish. Does look like it has a checkered front strap, which is pretty cool. Standard flat back, extended beaver tail, good iron sights, and it looks like it has a good aggressively textured set of grip panels on it, which, again, for a fighting 1911, that's pretty cool. Now, these are more than the Ruger 1911, but not by much. But for whatever reason you don't want the Ruger SR 1911, the standard full size, for whatever reason, but you want to stay in that similar price point, you might look at the Desert Eagle 1911s. When I've handled them, I've been impressed, and IWI is not really known for making junk, and I don't think their 1911s are that way either. The last one on the list, Smith & Wesson 1911. You're almost surely familiar with Smith & Wesson if you know anything about guns. They're not really known for their 1911s either, but they make really, really good 1911s. And I would say, kind of well-rounded, going back to the beginning of the episode, Colt make really good 1911s. I think Smith & Wessons are right on par with that. If we're talking about a fighting 1911, their SW 1911 TA E series. I think that just stands for tactical, the T. But it has a rail. It's full-size government. It's got kind of unique but very usable looking scallop serrations on the slide. Also, the good Novak sights. Now, they do have some performance center models, but again, I said I wanted to kind of stay out of that custom and semi-custom world, and I think their pro shop guns are kind of semi-custom. But their E-Series, that TA model, just maybe the most beautiful one on the list, but it's not made to be a safe queen. It's not meant to be a barbecue gun. It's meant to be used. It's a good fighting 1911. It's got a checkered front strap. It's got, again, those unique but very usable looking scallops on the slide. Really good iron sights for a good kind of combat usable iron sight. Does look like it has some cutaway in the ejection port. Also, one of the really cool things about, you may think it's cool, you may think it's an abomination, but the Smith & Wesson 1911s don't have the traditional internal extractor. If you're not familiar with 1911s in the world of shooting 1911s a lot, the extractors are an expendable part. Like, they wear out, much like the recoil spring on many guns. They have to be tuned, they have to be hand fitted and tuned to the particular gun, which, if you're not in the world of the 1911s, may kind of give you an occasion for pause and think about that. The Smith & Wesson 1911s have an external extractor, so not a traditional 1911 extractor, but it's very beefy. I have, other than people that just don't like it because they say it's not a real 1911 if it has an external extractor, I don't know of anybody that's complained of them from a performance standpoint. They seem to be made very well. They shouldn't need to be tuned or anything like that. If they're anything like the big beefy steel extractors on the Smith & Wesson M&P, then in my opinion, some of the beefiest, most robust extractors for handguns on the market. Really, really good choice. And I think it's going to round out the... Oh, and I should mention that one is stainless, which I'm all about stainless. I like stainless. Now, that should round out the picks for what I think are the top fighting 1911s of 2023. If you have one I didn't choose, you can contact me, goodshepherdtraining.com, or maybe leave it in a review. That said, those are my picks. You may notice I did not mention Springfield on this list. That is very intentional. It's not like I forgot about them. I very intentionally did not put them on the list. I would not recommend them for a fighting handgun in a 1911 or any other. With that, I'm going to wrap up the episode. Tactical tip of the day. If you are going to run a 1911 for fighting, you're going to get more mags, get Wilson Combat mags. The general go-to is the 47D, but you may want a different capacity or whatever. But Wilson Combat mags, they are worth the money. Also, I should mention, since we talked about 45 ACP, some of my go-to 45 ACP loads. I'm going to mention two that I have trusted my life to as a professional gunfighter. And yes, I have carried a 1911 single stack 45 as a professional gunfighter when I could carry many other guns. Now, it wasn't always my go-to, but sometimes mission dependent it was, and it's what I wanted over a high capacity plastic 9mm. But two loads that I'm going to recommend if they feed in your gun and they shoot point of impact, point of aim for you and fired by you. The first one is the Federal HST 230 grain. It's a phenomenal load. I'm not a big fan of plus P because in general my practice loads aren't plus P, and I like to have continuity of training and point of aim, point of impact. Just the 230 grain Federal HST. That's my number one pick. My number two pick is going to be the Hornady Critical Duty. That one is plus P. It's hard cast. It's good for certain things. It's my second choice, but it's still a good choice for a go-to fighting load for the 1911. And for 45 ACP in general, for that matter. Talking about a handgun with endurance. We're talking 1911. It's been around since 1911. Well over 100 years. And that reminded me of a verse for the tactical verse of the day that I was reading just today before I went into the gym. And when you hear of wars and chaos Do not be terrified, for these things need to happen first, but the end will not come at once." Then he continued telling them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, along with famines, epidemics in various places, and there will be terrors, along with great signs from heaven." And he goes on and talks about the tribulation. I'm not going to read the whole passage. But a short while after that, talking about the same thing, he says, "And you will be hated by all because of my name, yet not a hair of your head will be lost. By your endurance you will gain your souls." Some translations, I think the King James, New King James, says, "He who endures to the end will be saved." Endurance. It's a good, manly quality, especially for a gunfighter. Endurance. Stay in the fight. If you're still breathing, stay in the fight. Don't give up. Keep fighting, whether that's a literal, physical, martial combat or a battle in your mind. Stay in the fight. Don't give up. With that, men, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.